I was a child, my father and I often traveled along the coast. He was the captain of a fishing vessel, and every time he went on a voyage, I stayed with my Uncle Harold in his little house by the sea. But the highlight of those trips was the lighthouse. It stood a few miles from our settlement, on a rocky peninsula known as Bone Cape. The lighthouse was abandoned, tall, black, with broken windows. The old fisherman would tell stories that it had been built in the 19th century, but was abandoned after the mysterious disappearance of the keeper. People said that at night, you could see a light shining, although no one knew how it appeared. When I was 10 years old, I finally decided to approach it. One gloomy day, while Uncle was repairing the boat, I set off alone. The rain hung in the air, the wind whipped my face. The lighthouse door was half open. Inside was dark and damp, smelling of mold and sea salt. The stairs creaked under my weight, and the walls seemed alive, as if they were catching every breath I took. On the wall hung an old calendar, 1926. The entire house seemed frozen in time. I found the keeper's abandoned room. On the table lay yellowed papers, the pages soaked with moisture. They were written in an illegible hand, but I managed to make out some words. The light burns every night. I hear their voices. I am not alone. I climbed the stairs to the upper level. The lantern was shattered, glass shards covered the floor. But the scariest part awaited me further. At the bottom, near the entrance, stood a man. He couldn't come in, he just stood and looked up. He was tall, thin, wearing a long coat that seemed wet, as if he had just come out of the water. I couldn't see his face, but I felt he was looking at me. My heart raced, and my legs seemed to freeze in place. I tried not to breathe, hoping he would disappear, but he didn't move. I don't remember how I ran out. I only remember how my feet slid on the wet grass, and my heart pounded in my chest. I ran to Uncle's house, but didn't say anything. I just lay in bed and tried to forget. The next morning, Uncle suggested we go to the lighthouse together. He didn't believe in the fishermen's tales, and thought it was just my imagination. We left early in the morning when the sea was calm and the fog lay on the ground. Inside, it was empty. No signs of the man. But something was wrong. A new inscription appeared on the wall, written in uneven letters. "You will return." Uncle didn't see it. He asked me why I was so nervous, but I just shook my head. I never wanted to go back there. Years passed. I grew up, moved to another city, started a new life. But the lighthouse never left my memory. It returned to me in dreams, always the same, with windows glowing at night, with a shadow standing at the entrance. I would wake up in a cold sweat, feeling like someone was watching me. Once, as an adult, I decided to return. I wanted to prove that it was just a child's nightmare. But when I reached Bone Cape, the lighthouse was gone. In its place was only overgrown grass and the remnants of an old foundation. I used to work as an engineer maintaining old lighthouses along the eastern coast. Most of them had long been automated, but once a year, they still required a manual inspection. One of them, Mason Rock Lighthouse, was located on a remote island about 20 kilometers from shore. It once had a keeper, but due to the isolation and harsh conditions, he had abandoned the post years ago, leaving the lighthouse to function only as an automatic beacon. When I was assigned the annual inspection, I didn't think much of it. I was an experienced engineer and had worked in similar conditions before. They provided me with standard gear, a backpack with supplies, a radio, a flashlight, and a logbook for notes. The journey to the island took almost 3 hours. I felt an unusual sense of unease, but brushed it off as exhaustion. When my boat docked at the narrow wooden pier, the sun was already beginning to set. Climbing the old stone steps leading from the shore to the lighthouse entrance, I noticed a few unsettling details. The door, which was supposed to be locked, was only slightly ajar. That was odd, but I figured the previous inspector might have forgotten to secure it properly. Inside, a damp, stale smell filled the air, tinged with something rotten. Everything looked as if no one had lived there in years. But one thing immediately caught my attention: an open logbook on the table in the main room. It belonged to the last inspector who had conducted the check a few months earlier. I sat down and flipped through the pages. At first, the entries were ordinary. August 19th. Everything is working fine. The radio beacon needs minor repairs. August 20th. Heard footsteps on the stairs at night. No one should be here. A chill ran down my spine. August 21st. The door was open this morning. I'm sure I locked it. August 22nd. I feel like I'm being watched. I hear breathing nearby, but no one is here. That was the last entry. I looked around. The inspector's belongings were still there. His backpack, flashlight, even leftovers of food that had long since molded. But the inspector himself was nowhere to be found. I decided to finish my work quickly and leave the island before nightfall. Climbing the spiral stairs to the upper level of the lighthouse, I began checking the equipment. Everything seemed functional, aside from some minor issues. But as I leaned down to inspect the wiring, I heard a sound. A quiet sigh behind me. I spun around. No one was there. The dim light cast deep shadows, making every corner seem darker than it should have been. I tried to ignore my imagination and got back to work. Then another sound. This time, footsteps. They came from below, near the entrance. I turned off my flashlight and froze. The footsteps grew closer. I told myself it could be a fisherman or maybe another Coast Guard worker who arrived unannounced. I called out, but only silence answered. Then I saw it. A dark figure stood on the staircase. Tall, motionless. It didn't move, didn't speak, just stood there watching me. Cold fear gripped me. I slowly stepped backward, trying not to make a sound. My fingers found the door to the maintenance room, and I quietly shut it behind me, hoping I hadn't been seen. Minutes dragged on like hours. When I finally dared to peek out, the staircase was empty. I wasn't staying any longer. Grabbing my backpack, I rushed to the exit. But when I stepped outside, I saw something even worse. The same figure was now standing at the shore, right next to my boat. I couldn't believe my eyes. It was there, completely still, but somehow I knew it saw me. I had to act fast. I reached into my backpack, pulled out a signal flare, and fired it into the sky. I didn't expect anyone to hear me, but it was the only thing I could think of. When I looked back, the figure was gone. I ran to the boat, started the engine, and pushed off from the shore without looking back. The next day, I reported the inspector's disappearance to the Coast Guard. The official report claimed he had most likely fallen into the water and drowned. But I knew the truth, because when I had sailed a safe distance away, I took one last look at the lighthouse. And at the very top, behind the glass of the lantern room, stood the dark figure, watching me. My job as a night guard on a remote island began quite normally and seemed unremarkable, though I was aware that it might appear unusual to most people. The island was small and located far from any major transportation routes. On it stood an old lighthouse, which had long been abandoned. Throughout its history, it had served generations of sailors, but after the automation of lighthouses, it was left behind, and there was no longer any need to keep a guard there. The island had essentially become a spot for nature lovers, fishermen, and a few tourists who came on weekends. My job was simple. I was supposed to keep an eye out for any trespassers or people who shouldn't be there. And of course, I had to check the condition of the lighthouse. Year after year, night after night, I was alone on the island, and nothing ever changed. The lighthouse, though old and neglected on the outside, was completely intact inside. I lived in a small building near the lighthouse, where everything was familiar and safe, though a little lonely. I had grown used to the monotony of my work and quickly began to observe everything around me. Far from people, far from the city's noise, I had time for reflection and observation. But one of those nights changed everything. It was the first of many nights I would never forget. That evening, I was sitting in my guard shack, reviewing footage from the surveillance cameras when I noticed something strange. It seemed like something was moving on the grounds near the lighthouse. At first, I didn't think much of it, assuming it was just the wind or some movement caught on the cameras. But I couldn't shake the feeling that something was off. The shadow on the screen moved with a purpose, heading directly toward the lighthouse. I immediately threw on my jacket, went outside, and started checking the area. The wind was wild that night, and the rain was pounding the ground like a drum, yet everything around me was eerily quiet. There was no sound except the crash of the waves against the cliffs. But as I approached the lighthouse, the silence became almost unnatural. The doors to the lighthouse, which I always checked and which had never shown any signs of disturbance, were now ajar. My heart raced in my chest as I thought, maybe someone had gotten inside, but I couldn't shake the feeling that this was more than just a coincidence. I cautiously stepped inside the dark building and grabbed a flashlight from the shelf. The interior seemed to have been abandoned for decades. The old walls were barely holding together. The wooden floors creaked as though they might collapse under my feet, and the entire place seemed to be covered in dust and neglect. But the strangest thing was that it was deathly quiet. There was no rustling, no sounds that might indicate life. With each step I took inside the lighthouse, I became more uneasy. I checked the rooms, and the further I went, the more unsettling the feeling grew. Then, in a small room, I found some old, damp, yellowed records lying on a wooden desk. I began to go through them, but most of the writing was illegible. I could only make out a few phrases. The light burns at night. I hear their voices. I'm not alone. With each line, it became harder to read, as though the paper itself was turning to dust. After scanning through the records, I decided to climb to the top of the lighthouse, even though I had a growing sense that something wasn't right. When I reached the stairs, my legs felt like they were being weighed down. I felt a strange heaviness, and with every step, the weight seemed to grow. Finally, after reaching the top, I began to look around. The lighthouse's lantern room was empty, and then I saw him. A man stood on the lower platform near the door, motionless. He was tall, dressed in black, with a long coat that seemed wet, as though he had just emerged from the sea. His face was hidden by the darkness, but I could feel his gaze piercing through me. I knew he was watching me. I was frozen in shock. I tried to regain control of myself, but my legs wouldn't obey. All I could do was stand there, silently staring at the dark figure. What felt like several minutes passed, though in reality, it was likely only a few moments, and I realized I couldn't stay in that spot any longer. I ran out of the lighthouse, though I couldn't understand why I was so terrified. I ran back to the guard shack, breathing heavily, and locked the door behind me. The next day, I decided to return to the lighthouse. But this time, I wasn't alone. I decided to bring the police with me. Maybe a tourist or a fisherman had snuck in without permission. But when we arrived, we found nothing that could explain what I had seen. The lighthouse was gone. In its place was only a patch of overgrown grass and the remnants of the old foundation. I never went back to that island again. The lighthouse disappeared, but the memories of what I saw stayed with me. And I feel that something is still there, though I don't know if I'll ever be able to understand what it was.